Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. And I think this is the session, I dare say, all of you have been waiting for. It's quite remarkable, Morgan's journey. Morgan, thank you very much, first of all, for being here. It's a great pleasure to be with you in person. Psychology of money. I mean, that's the, I'll tell you, I was telling Morgan a small anecdote. I have a 14-year-old daughter, and I was telling you this earlier. I've been trying to get her interested in finance and money for the last few years now without success. And I finally got her sort of onto the psychology of money, Morgan's book. And she's taken to it, hopefully, I think, in a full way over the next couple of years. So once again, thank you very much, Morgan.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to start by asking you, how did you get started? How did you start writing? And writing so prolifically?
I started writing by accident. It was never part of the plan. I never wanted to be a writer. I never aspired to be a writer. I wanted to be an investment banker or a hedge fund manager. And I graduated college in 2008. Fun year, awesome year in the global economy, 2008. So, of course, nobody was hiring in 2008. Everybody was laying people off. One little story about that. In 2008, I submitted my resume to a large investment bank. And a week later, they hadn't responded. And I reached out and said, hey, I just wanted to make sure you got my resume. And they said, oh, I'm sorry, we laid off the entire HR department. There's nobody to receive your resume anymore. So that was what trying to find a finance job was like in 2008. So I needed something to do. I had no idea what I had no backup plan. And out of desperation, not out of enjoyment or skill, out of desperation, I took a job as a finance writer for the Motley Fool. And I thought I would do that for 6 months or so before I found a real finance job. But I ended up just sticking with it. And the first couple of years, I really didn't like it. I was not any good at it. It was not any fun. But I just needed a paycheck. But and then as the years went on, it got a little bit more enjoyable. I kind of found my niche a little bit. But I think lots of careers are like that. You often hear from college graduates in particular, or like recent college graduates, and they have a plan. I'm going to do this for 2 years, and I'm going to move to this career and get promoted here. And it never works like that. Like, it's great to have a plan, but almost everyone's career will just end up more serendipitous like that. And that was definitely true for me.
And you, in your books, you talk about the role of luck. So I think this is one of those, and I'll get to that in just a bit, right? But right at the beginning, how do you invest your money? I believe index funds, Morgan, a large part of it?
I keep it as simple as possible. And I always say, just because I invest like this doesn't mean I'm recommending other people do it. Because everybody's different. There's different geographies, different countries, different generations. But I keep it as painfully simple as I can. It's overwhelmingly index funds. And the reason I do that is not because I think nobody can outperform the market. I don't believe that. I think smart investors can, have, and will.
So just to be clear, you've got nothing against active investing?
Nothing in the slightest. But the variable that I want to maximize for is endurance. And if I can be an average investor for the next 30 or 40 or 50 years, I know that I'm going to achieve all of my goals and then some. And so it just comes down to what variable do you want to maximize. And some very smart people can maximize for annual performance. And that's great. They can do that. Some of them will do well. A lot of them won't, but some of them will. But if you instead just say, I'm going to maximize endurance and strength and longevity, I think that is more in your control. And over time, over the course of your life, I think you will maximize the actual dollars of wealth that you accumulate.
We've had in India, Morgan, a bit of I think the US is starting a bit of a wobbly, it's had a few wobbly sessions now. In India, of course, the market topped out in September. We had a painful correction. And now we're finding our feet once again. And a lot of people, when they are asked to describe what kind of market we had, they use this term, we had a narrative-based market, right? I mean, stories, narratives. And I think it's a topic you touch upon in your writings quite regularly, that at the end of the day, investing is storytelling. It's a number now multiplied by a story in the future. Yep. How important is that? I mean, is that recognition essentially? Because, you go through these cycles. Sometimes these stories and narratives do very well, but then we have periods when you have to go back to the numbers.
Yeah, it's always the case that markets are narrative driven, and the narratives change all the time. And I think sometimes we want to pretend in investing that of that equation, every valuation is a number from today multiplied by a story about tomorrow. We want to pretend that the number from today is the most important part, because it's what we can quantify, it's what we can look at. But the truth is, the story that we tell ourselves, positive or negative, is always the more important thing. And now, not to get too technical, but the lower interest rates are, the the more powerful that story is. And for a lot of the last decade, at least in the United States, we had 0% interest rates. So the story was everything. And particularly in a social media-driven world, the stories that people can tell themselves get ridiculous. Because no matter what you want to believe in investing, somebody is on Twitter saying it. You can find that narrative anywhere, and it creates a situation where the wildest stories, the craziest stories just grab a holding and go and run away. I mean, look at Tesla, for example. Tesla makes a tiny fraction of the number of cars of Volkswagen, Toyota, General Motors, go on the list, but it's worth 20, 30, 50 times more than those other car companies. The other stat I saw the other day is that Ferrari makes 13,000 cars per year and is worth $90 billion. Volkswagen makes 9 million cars per year and is worth $40 billion. The difference between that is overwhelmingly just narrative. It's that Ferrari is fun and whatnot. There's different narratives involved. And I think this throws a lot of people for a loop if you are like analytically minded and you want to think that the world should work in clean, rational ways. You think like a spreadsheet. Then this world will drive you crazy. And you constantly think that the world is either a bubble or just like losing. You're always confused about what's going on. But when you view it as a narrative, then it starts to make sense. Yes, things are crazy. Yes, a lot of things don't make any sense whatsoever. No, you can't put a statistic on everything that's going on in the world. And it's always been like that, and it always will be.
And there's also a lot of it, what you said, those numbers about how many cars Ferrari, Volkswagen, etc. sell. I mean, one is looking back, and the other, of course, is betting on the future, which is the story, which is what you're talking about. Not necessarily wrong, but you have to acknowledge that's what's happening all around you, right? That's what you're saying.
Yeah, and those stories can change by the day, by the week.
Yeah.
You know, Donald Trump has come up with 17 different trade policies in the last week. So those stories change all the time. And it's always been the case, too, that hindsight gives us this idea that the past was way more certain than it actually was. So we go back and say, like, oh, there's a lot of uncertainty today, but we pretend like there wasn't uncertainty 10 years ago. That if we went back to 2015, that we were all calm and happy and everything was great. And of course, that's not the case whatsoever. If you went back to 2015, people were actually so worried and nervous about all the uncertainty that we had back then. We were just worried about something else. And so it is always the case that we assume that we never had uncertainty before now, which is, of course, complete nonsense. So is there uncertainty today in global? Of course, there's a lot, and no one knows what's going to happen next. And that has always been the case. So just coming to terms with that, I think makes investing, it's not that it becomes more comfortable that you say like, oh, you know what's going to happen next. You become much more comfortable just shrugging your shoulders and say, I have no idea and nobody else does. And by the way, that's what you get paid for in investing, is putting up with uncertainty rather than assuming that you do know what's going to happen next.
I mean, as someone said, I'm much better with someone who tells me broadly what's going to happen rather than precisely what's going to happen. Right. I mean, that's the idea, right? And the other thing, of course, I mean, is it's a FOMO, fear of missing out. And it's a powerful sort of, it sucks people in. We've seen that here in India, right at the top. I mean, a lot of investors who write into us, ask us questions, and we say, well, show us your portfolio. And we look at the portfolios. There are a lot of stocks that we ask them, well, why did you buy it? There are no clear answers. I mean, there was that strong pull. Money begets money. And so that you can't resist it. It's just too strong. Just talk to us for a minute about that, because you write about that quite often.
Yeah, I think social media and just broader financial media makes it harder than it's ever been, because no matter how well you're doing, there is somebody out there who at least will tell you that they're doing better, whether they actually are or not. And so it creates this idea that you're always falling behind. And I think if there is one single financial skill that you have to have, absolute prerequisite to doing well over time, it's a lack of FOMO. You cannot do well financially over time if you're susceptible to FOMO. It's impossible. And really what FOMO is it's outsourcing your analysis to somebody else's emotions, is effectively what you're doing. You're looking at somebody else, some other asset class or some investor, and you're saying, they're doing better than I did. I need to catch up with them. You can't outrun that train. And so I think there's so many different financial skills that are important over time. The base of that pyramid, if you cannot control FOMO, you should give up at investing. It's never going to work.
But how do you get rid of it? I think everyone has it. One is born with it.
I think a lot of people have it. I don't know if everybody has it. There's a great quote from my friend Brent Beshore where he says, "I am 100% happy watching you make money and get rich doing something that I have no interest in." And so I think you just have to understand what you're good at and what you're not. And if you can't describe what you are not good at, it's going to be very hard to do well as an investor. So most investors, if you ask them, what's your skill, they'll tell you what they're good at. Oh, I understand this industry. I have these connections. I think more important is for people to be able to very clearly outline what they cannot do and that they're staying away from. And this is another thing in investing where a lot of people are very well educated, a lot of big IQs, very smart people in the industry. Those are the people who are least likely to admit or to be able to explain what they are incapable of doing. And I think the best investors of the world are the ones who will list 100 things that they can't do, and they stay away from them. They never want to get close to it. And I think that's one way to avoid FOMO, is you can watch somebody getting rich in crypto or commodities. And I would say, I don't know anything about those industries. I know nothing about those industries. I'm going to stay 100 miles away. There's nothing I can do about it. I think knowing what you can't do and are incapable of is more important than knowing what you can do.
I think that's very well put. The role of luck is another thing you sort of talk about in your writings quite frequently, Morgan. In bull markets, we're all geniuses. I mean, it's a timeless story. But when the tide goes out, we start to look to blame someone. I mean, macros or Trump or tariffs or interest rates or something or the other, right? There's always something. But if you acknowledge that a large part of it is essentially, luck in a variety of ways, it's again admitting that you don't know you don't know it all. So it's kind of a buffer, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when people say luck, they hate that word because if I say you got lucky, it just makes me look jealous and bitter. So I think luck can sometimes be the wrong word. But if you ask, what is repeatable? What is something that I know I can keep doing over and over again? That's very different. During the last 20 or 30 years, Bill Gross from PIMCO at the time was known as the greatest bond fund manager to ever live. He was known as the bond king. Nobody was better at managing bonds than he was. And he gave this very honest and humble interview a couple years ago where he was like, look, my career started when interest rates were at an all-time high and ended when interest rates were at an all-time low. As a bond fund manager, it does not get any better than that. And that was just a dumb piece of luck based on when he was born. And he said in the interview, he was, look, if I were born 10 years earlier or 10 years later, I would not have had the career that I had. Same with Warren Buffett. He, the greatest investor of all time, absolute genius, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody knows. If he were born 20 years later, he would not have had the career that he had. When he made most of his money in percentage terms, kind of around the 1960s, 70s, he was buying blue chip companies for 2 times earnings. That doesn't exist anymore. So if Warren Buffett were 40 years old today, he would do well. He would do fine, but not nearly like he did at the time. It was a product of when he was born. And nobody wants to admit that they got lucky again. It's just, if I were born in a different country or a different generation, I would have a very different life. And so would you, and so would all of you. And sometimes that difference would be better. Sometimes it would be worse. And so everyone wants to think that their successes were due to their hard work and genius, and any of their failures were just due to poor luck. Like, we're very cognizant of bad luck. We're very cognizant of risk. And we can identify very clearly when something didn't go right in our favor. But good luck, on the other hand, we always want to say that it was because of what we did right.
You say focus on what is repeatable, what never changes, rather than trying to predict the next big thing, the next big event, the next big change in that sense. There are those who would say, push back to that and say, well, take where we are now, AI and all these big, huge technological changes which are happening. Of course, we don't know in what part of that entire value chain maximum amount of money would be made. But is it wrong to bet on those things? I mean, emerging technology. I mean, for example, internet back in 99. I mean, if you just had to get that right to make a lot of money.
I think we know that now. Yeah. We know that in hindsight that was the case. But there are a lot of smart people back in the late 1990s who really genuinely thought the internet was a fad. We could poke fun at that, but there were also a lot of things that we thought were the future that never that never happened. I mean, one of my favorite examples of this is the Wright Brothers created the first functioning airplane. The people who invented the airplane did not think that it had any commercial use. They targeted their airplane almost exclusively to the U.S. Army because they thought that was the only use case that they would have for an airplane. No, even the Wright brothers did not foresee that you could fly around the world, you could go on your vacations, you could fly from Seattle to Mumbai like I did yesterday. The people who invented the plane didn't see it coming. And I think, too, if you asked Bill Gates back in the 1980s what the personal computer would come to, he would not have gotten it right. So even the people who have the most inside information, who create these products, cannot foresee what they're going to go to. So it's obvious now that AI is going to do something very different to the world, that the world 10 years from now will not be the world that it is today because of AI. But even the people who work at OpenAI, even the people developing these models, have no clue what those changes are going to do. That's always been the case with new history.
I think you're absolutely right. Here in India, for example, a lot of people always say, well, HDFC Bank, one of the largest private sector banks in the country, compounded for 20% for many, many years. Will say, you should have bought HDFC Bank back then. I mean, but it was never clear. I mean, the people running HDFC Bank did not know that it would become HDFC Bank. I'm just giving an example, like what you did with Microsoft or, other companies in the U.S. So just a quick point. I mean, in the U.S. right now, AI and tech, since we're on that topic, do you think, is there any way to tell whether it's a bit of a bubble at this point, Morgan? I mean, the way these companies are being valued?
I think, one example I've used before is if you go back to the early 1900s, there were 2,000 car companies in the United States, and 1,997 of them went bankrupt. And don't exist anymore. The survivors were GM, Ford, and Chrysler, two of which themselves ended up going bankrupt eventually. And so it's always the case that in any new industry, in 10 or 20 years' time, 90% of the companies don't exist anymore. Yeah. It's true, too. If let's say it's back in the 1990s, and you believe the internet is the future, what companies would you have bet on? AOL, AskJeeves.com, all these companies that don't exist anymore, Yahoo,
Pet Foods or something.
Exactly, and nobody would have said Google, which was a tiny little startup, Facebook, which obviously didn't even exist yet. Mark Zuckerberg was still in high school. And so it's always the case in any new industry that even if you get the trend right, getting the individual names right is 1,000 times harder.
Do we have but in the AI space in the US, do we have a bubble, do you think so? Or you have a view, do you feel strongly about it at all? One way or the other?
I think I think it's not mutually exclusive to say this industry is going to fundamentally change the world, and the vast majority of investors will lose a lot of money. I mean, this is true for railroads in the United States, which is probably the most transformative new industry that we've ever had in the U.S. was railroads back in the 1800s. It just took the country from the Stone Age into the modern world. And I forget the exact statistic, but I think 97% or something like that of railroads went out of business. So this completely changed the world. Like nothing was more transformative. And if you were a railroad investor, almost everybody lost money. I mean, same with airlines. Completely transformed society in every way imaginable. And virtually every airline investor for the last century has lost their money. So it's not uncommon for that to be the case, that industries that are the most transformative for society are the most difficult for investors to make money on. And by the way, if the opposite is true, would have been some of the best investments to make over the last 100 years, cigarettes, beer, toilet paper, like the most boring things that don't change the world at all can in some cases be incredible investments as well.
Impact on investing, just to finish that point about AI, is it already changing the way investing is done? Artificial intelligence, tools related to it?
I think it's an extension of a trend that's been going on for a long time, which is that even 20 years ago, having different information was what set different investors apart. So Buffett used to talk about this. The reason that he was so successful back in the 1960s is because he was the only investor in the world practically who was willing to sift through every single annual report. And he would go through thousands and thousands. He had an informational advantage just out of effort that other people didn't have. And you know, that was true 20 or 30 years ago, that Goldman Sachs had information that you and I didn't. And so they were going to earn better returns than us. And I think by and large that doesn't exist anymore. That virtually every investor is looking at the same information with the same models. Broadly, that is true because it's all right here and it's all for free. And so AI is an extension of that, where, you know, now it's moving into having knowledge is not really that much of any competitive advantage. That the information that you could get by having your CFA or whatnot, that takes years and years to get, and they're, you know, very educated people, that now you have that in an LLM and everybody in the world has access to it on their phone. And I think what that means in that world where information and even intelligence is not a competitive advantage anymore, of course I'm talking my own book here, but that's when behavior becomes more important. It's like if everybody has the same information and the same models, then the person who has the best behavior is going to be the one who wins. That's definitely the case. Was not the case in the past, but it is more and more the case these days. And that's why I think it becomes less and less about, can you pick the right companies? Do you pay attention to where the economy is going this quarter? That becomes less and less important, and all that matters effectively is, can you keep your head on straight during moments of turmoil? Are you going to panic?
Behavior and temperament.
That's always been important, but it's more important now than it's ever been.
Yeah. Morgan, we read what you write. What do you read?
I read anything that looks even remotely interesting to me, from any topic imaginable. So a very wide funnel where I'll start reading anything. But I have a very tight filter in terms of if a book or an article is not hooking me in, I abandon it very quickly. And so I probably only finish maybe 5% of the books that I start. And I think a lot of people don't like reading because they feel obligated to finish every book that they start. And I think that's a mistake. If a book's not working for you, you should quit very quickly. And so I'll start reading almost anything, but I quit it quickly.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, Devendra Fadnavis, in the hall with us. A round of applause for Mr. Fadnavis. Thank you, sir. I mean, just to wrap this up, Morgan, who are your heroes in life and investing?
There's a great song, or a great quote from the Foo Fighters song, There Goes My Hero. And the quote is, "There goes my hero, he's ordinary." And I love that idea because if you're a student of history, like most people in this room are, most of history is about the big figures. Winston Churchill, Thomas Edison, like the big people that we all know. But that is such a small fraction of history. The vast majority of history are ordinary people who are trying to do a little bit better, raising their family, living a better life, that I think have the most interesting stories. And so many of my heroes are just ordinary people that never get any attention, never get any press or limelight, but those are the people who in aggregate can live incredible lives and actually move the world forward.
Absolutely, so well put. And I think you bring out those stories so well in your books. And that's what makes your book so enriching, insightful, and entertaining. And I hope I get my daughter to sort of stay on the book and sort of ignite a spark in finance through your books, as I think all of us have done here. Thank you very much, Morgan Housel, for being with us here this evening. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.